Xenophanes of Colophon wrote in poetic form, and it's very interesting. A lot of these early Greek philosophers wrote large poems. And part of the reason for that is this. Books were very expensive. You'd have to copy them out by hand. And it was very much easier to remember things if you had a certain meter to it. And so there were people who, at the time, memorized all of the Iliad and Odyssey, rhapsodes. And sometimes just ordinary people who had the leisure to be educated would memorize entire texts as vast as the Iliad or the Odyssey. And so these philosophical works, which were much shorter than that, were oftentimes written in verse to facilitate memorizing them completely. It helped, unfortunately. People, by depending on memory, didn't leave enough copies for us to have gotten any complete ones. Page 26. These are fragments that deal specifically with the gods. And, again, they're very revealing. Give us no fights with Titans, no, nor giants, nor centaurs, the forgeries of our fathers, nor civil brawls in which no advantage is, but always to be mindful of the gods is good. That's a very interesting and maybe somewhat ironically constructed fragment, because what he's doing in these texts is he's saying, look, Titans, giants, centaurs, all this fanciful mythology can't really be true. It's all anthropomorphic. It's all so clearly connected with our own culture and history. Wouldn't it be convenient, remarkably and unbelievably convenient, if the gods were really so much like us Greeks? Number 3, Homer and Hesiod have ascribed to the gods all deeds which among men are a reproach and a disgrace, thieving, adultery, and deceiving one another. If they're gods, you'd think they'd be above all. Mortals believe that the gods are born and have human clothing, voice, and form. Preposterous. Who are we to think that the highest things in the universe are just like us? 5. Ethiopians say that their gods are flat-nosed and dark. Thracians that theirs are blue-eyed and red-haired. 6. If oxen and horses and lions had hands and were able to draw with their hands and do the same thing as men, horses would draw the shapes of gods to look like horses and oxen to look like oxen, and each would make the gods' bodies have the same shape as they themselves had. So this is a recognition of the nature of mythological thinking that works as a kind of unmasking of it or undermining of it, because it does seem rather convenient that the highest beings in the cosmos act like a bunch of Greeks and look like a bunch of Greeks. And if you go to Ethiopia, you find that they look and act like Ethiopians, and so on and so forth for every other religion. And that just can't be right. This kind of notion of the gods just can't be correct. However, Xenophanes did believe that there was a kind of God. And Xenophanes' God, though, is the kind of God that you would expect among philosophers. He's just a mind, not a body. This is the perfect God for people who leave the theoretical life and fall down wells in the process. Number 8, God is one, greatest among gods and men, not at all like mortals in body or thought. So God is going to be entirely other than the mortals, than mortal things. All of him sees, all of him thinks, all of him hears, which means that there are no non-mind parts to God. God doesn't have a body in some sense. Number 9 at the bottom of page 26. All of him sees, all of him thinks, all of him hears. So God is a seeing, thinking, hearing thing, and he's all thinking, seeing, and hearing. Everything about God is just the activity of knowing in some sense. God is the divinization of the activity of knowing, theorizing. Number 10 at the top of 27. But without effort, of course philosophers love to do things with as little effort as possible. This is why leisure is so important. Without effort, he shakes all things by the thought of his mind. Although God has no body in a sense, and is just all thinking, everything is set in motion by this activity of thought. However, it's fairly clear that he doesn't think that this kind of God is the kind of God who's concerned with human affairs. It's not the kind of God that anybody but a philosopher could really find much in common with. And the gods of the Greek philosophers were, we would say, improvident. They didn't exercise any concern or care for human affairs. And that meant, especially this, they didn't exercise any concern or care over moral matters. There's nothing about divine or moral law, or the legislation of any kind of moral law, in these conceptions of the gods. They're entirely theoretical gods, divorced from the whole realm of practice and human affairs. On page 27, number 16, Xenophanes says that the things on boats which shine like stars are little clouds which shine as a result of the moon. These are heavenly phenomena, okay, that people looked up to and named, in some sense. And he's just saying, look, these are just natural phenomena. Heavenly phenomena which were treated as gods in traditional thought were just treated as natural phenomena by people like Xenophanes and others. Okay, we're going to see a lot of that in the clouds, and it's an extremely important characteristic of pre-Socratic thought. Now let's flip to Anaxagoras. Anaxagoras is mentioned frequently by name in the text that we're going to be reading. And the reason for that is this. Anaxagoras was born around 500 BC. Okay, he was from Clazomene, and he came to Athens and was an associate of Pericles, a teacher of Pericles, who was the great statesman of Athens in the 5th century BC. He was reputed to claim that the sun, which most people thought was a god, was just a big burning rock. And he was pretty much correct about that. It's just a big burning gas bag, as it turns out. But the fact that he thought that the sun was a great big burning ball of rock made the Athenians think that he was impious. He clearly didn't believe in the gods of Athens. And so what they did is they put him on trial for impiety, and he was exiled from the city, and he died, according to this text, in Ionia, near Troy, in the city of Lampascus in 428 BC. So Anaxagoras was the first philosopher that the Athenians ran out of town, okay, for impiety. And also, Socrates claims to have read his work, and there are many ancient testimonia to the fact that Socrates was a student in some way of Anaxagoras at one period of time in his life. And Socrates, in the Apology, Plato's Apology, says, "You take me for Anaxagoras? Don't you know the difference between me and Anaxagoras?" He was dogged with this reputation of having studied Anaxagoras' teachings. Although he might not ever have known Anaxagoras personally, he still had the reputation of following Anaxagoras' teachings. Now, let me just talk a little bit about what Anaxagoras believed. It's very obscure. Anaxagoras basically believed that you could account for everything like this. If you wanted to explain why there are cups, that would be easy to explain, because what happens is there are microscopic cups, little cup seeds, as he puts it, that the cosmos consists of this great mixture of the seeds of things. So there are little book seeds and watch seeds and pen seeds and all these other kinds of things that are microscopically tiny. And the cosmos just consists of this great jumbled wash of microscopically tiny things. So the explanation for the existence of cups like these is that, well, visible cups are basically microscopic cup seeds that have been amalgamated and brought together into a sufficient size that they rise above the threshold of visibility and we can see them.
That's exactly what they are. They're polypropylene beads.
Yeah, but they're not all shaped like little cups, though. I mean, but yeah.
That's almost exactly what they are.
Yeah, but the thing is, what he's doing is basically this. The early Greek philosophers just believed that there's this one undifferentiated stuff, and that it takes on forms. Whereas he believed that the forms of everything were just as much already there as the stuff, and that the emergence of things into the world and their passing away could be explained simply in terms of them rising above or falling below the threshold of visibility, becoming amalgamated up to the size of something you can see and dissolving back into their microscopic constituents. Now, he believed that this process of things coming into being and passing away was actuated by this cosmic principle that you can call the vortex. It's this great spinning, swirling, cosmic whirlpool out there that moves everything around, and things sort of glom onto one another and get larger or get broken up and get smaller. And the principle that puts the whirlpool in motion he called nous, or mind. And what mind is just the most finely divided kind of matter there is. And so he's a complete materialist in some sense, and he has this it's just damnably peculiar, because it doesn't really explain the forms of things. It just presupposes that the forms are already there, you just can't see them. And it has this big whirlpool, and the whirlpool imparts motion, and the motion somehow, through necessity again, causes things to rise into visibility and collapse back into invisibility. And at the root of it is a force that he calls mind, but mind is indistinguishable from matter. In fact, mind itself is just a very finely divided kind of matter. Socrates was terribly interested in the theories of Anaxagoras, as we'll see. There's one particular passage on 56 to 57, that number 13, and that's fairly useful in just sort of explaining as best we can what Anaxagoras is up to. The rest have a portion of everything, but mind is unlimited and self-ruled and is mixed with no thing, but is alone and by itself. The rest, I guess, means all the other little seeds that are out there. For if it were not by itself, but were mixed with something else, it would have a share of all things if it were mixed with anything. It's very repetitive. For in everything there is a portion of everything, as I've said before. And the things mixed together with it would hinder it so that it would rule no thing in the same way as it does by being alone and by itself. So mind is set off on its own, pulling the strings, getting everything going. It's not mixed in and just dissipated in its power amongst all the things of the cosmos. For it is the finest of all things and the purest. Meaning it's matter, fine, pure matter. And it has all judgment about everything and the greatest power. And mind rules all things that possess life, both the larger and the smaller. And mind rules the entire rotation, so that it rotated in the beginning. And at first it began to rotate from a small area, but it rotates over a greater range and will rotate over a greater one. And so there's this vortex that starts in a small place, and it gets larger and larger and draws all the little seeds into it, and finally you get the world going round. And mind set in order all things, whatever kinds of things were to be, whatever were, and all that are now, and whatever will be. And also this rotation in which we are now rotating the stars and the sun and the moon, and the air and ether that are being separated off. This rotation caused the separating off. And so everything comes to be because of this great swirling material whirlpool. And at the root of it is this material force that he calls nous, or mind. Very peculiar stuff. So it's hard to see how it explains that much, but still, there it is. We possess so little of it that we really don't know much more than that. Now I want to go into Empedocles. Empedocles was born in Sicily a few years after Anaxagoras was. He was, according to the notes here, he was a very active politician in his home city. He was very much involved in affairs of the polis. Yet at the same time, he was a philosopher, and he again wrote in verse. And the poem of Empedocles survives in some fairly substantial fragments. He was rather an odd figure. Let me just read from page 60. It's just easiest to do. About 12 lines from the bottom on page 60. Empedocles was both a philosopher and a medical man, and he was a truly flamboyant figure. He dressed ostentatiously. Ancient reports tell of rich purple robes, a golden diadem, and bronze shoes. He claimed magical powers for himself. And in fragment B112 says of himself, "I go about among you an immortal god, no longer mortal, honored among all, as it seems, wreathed with headbands and blooming garlands." Empedocles believed he was a god. He believed he was a god because of the wisdom that he had attained, that had exalted him above the merely human. And this wasn't that unusual. In the 3rd century AD, the Neoplatonic philosopher Plotinus claimed that he had become a god. In fact, that he had done it several times. And Pythagoras, of an earlier generation, also from southern Italy, claimed to have become a god. So this is rather extraordinary. And again, it makes one suspicious about the philosopher's piety. Just as the image of God you get in Xenophanes sounds, suspiciously like a philosopher, you get philosophers going around and claiming, well, we are gods. We have become divine through this activity of philosophizing. Empedocles eventually tired his fellow citizens of him, and they exiled him. They sent him away. He died in Peloponnese, which is the part of Greece where Sparta exists. Empedocles took up certain elements of Pythagoreanism and also a religion known as Orphicism, which was a mystery religion that the ancient Greeks had. And it's worth talking about because you're going to see certain elements of this quasi-religious philosophy in the clouds too. The Pythagoreans basically believe something like this. There is a divine principle which is a mind. Little sparks of this divine principle somehow get cast off it like sparks are cast off a fire. And these little sparks go floating off into the darkness. Just think of a campfire. And instead of being extinguished, they get caught up in the material realm and become enmattered. Okay? And so what you have is you have souls, or spark bits of the great soul, God, caught up in material things, and you get animals, including human beings. These souls are alienated from their source, which is blissful and happy, and they, because they have bodies now, are capable of suffering. Therefore, life is suffering for all living things. And that's because we really don't belong here. Our souls are just trapped here for a short period of time. Fortunately, however, the divine has also set in motion a process by which we can return to our source. And what happens is this. Souls live out their lives in a body, and when the body dies, they are incarnated in new bodies, and they go through a cycle. And the cycle is governed by a kind of moral law. And if you are so lucky as to be a soul trapped in a human body, a rational soul, you can get a hold of the teachings of Pythagoras, and you can learn how you can get out of this endless cycle of birth and suffering and death and rebirth. And the way to do this is to purify your soul as much as possible of any connection with or admixture with the body. And the best way to do this is by engaging in intellectual activities that strengthen the soul. And the best kind of intellectual activities are the ones that have the least to do with anything practical. And so that would include science and mathematics. And Pythagoras was really the founder of mathematics as a theoretical activity. Before him, geometry was literally what the word means, which is earth measuring, and that's surveying. He turned geometry into a purely theoretical discipline. And the purpose of this was to separate the soul as much as possible from the body, so that when the body died, the soul would no longer be caught in this endless cycle of birth, rebirth, and suffering, and would instead ascend to and reunify itself with the annihilated as an individual entity and rejoin the original world soul, if you will. Now this all sounds very Buddhistic, and the Orphic religion, Orphic mystery religion of the time, taught very similar things. And what Pythagoras was in a sense, he was one of the first gurus of the West. He took up a certain religious kind of teaching and combined it with spiritual exercises that were designed to bring about the salvation of the soul. And these spiritual exercises involved study. They also involved other things. Asceticism, self-discipline, and self-denial were very important for him. So Pythagoreans would give up their attachments to worldly things. They would live together in little colonies. They would give their property over to the group for its maintenance. And they would practice vegetarianism. They would swear off sex and any of the other pleasures of the flesh. Because again, the pleasures of the flesh were considered rivets that keep the soul trapped and attached to the body. after a sufficient amount of this kind of preparation, living the Pythagorean life, one was supposed to become enlightened and then freed from suffering. And Empedocles basically accepted this kind of teaching and incorporated it into his work. The Pythagoreans were set up in a very interesting way. There was a distinction that was made among the Pythagoreans between the acousmatikoi and the mathematikoi. And acousmatikoi just means the listeners, the auditors. And according to this text, which quotes Iamblichus, who was a Pythagorean in late antiquity, they were two different sects of Pythagoreans. But I think the truth is that they represented two different stages within the Pythagorean hierarchy. The acousmatikoi were the neophytes. They're the people who became interested in Pythagoreanism, and they were undergoing a kind of initiation. And so they were only allowed to listen, and they were lectured to from behind a veil. Okay? They couldn't even see their teacher. They would come to the lectures, they would listen, they would begin these ascetic practices, they would give up their worldly possessions, they'd swear off sex and fun and meat and so forth. And the idea was that if they became sufficiently good students, they could graduate onto the next level. Now the Pythagoreans were very clever about this. If you were a bad student, they wouldn't tell you that you were a bad student. They'd say, congratulations, you've learned all of our secrets. You're now a full-fledged Pythagorean. And they would give them a diploma and send them on their way. It was sort of a movie prize. And they would go off happy and feeling enlightened. I guess in that sense you could say that there would be two sects, there are two different groups. The ones who flunked out, would be just the listeners. But the next level would be to become one of the mathematikoi, which means knowers. And they went on to various degrees of Pythagorean wisdom and so forth. It became really sort of a model for every kind of organization like this that's ever existed since, from the Freemasons to Dianetics, I suppose. You go through all these different levels of initiation, keep paying in, and, getting wiser and wiser and more enlightened until finally, when you die, that's just the end. I've never understood that. I always thought that I would like to be reincarnated as many times as possible, because I really don't experience life as suffering. They did. They experienced life as great suffering, and therefore just wanted to get rid of it. Now, Empedocles took very seriously these sorts of teachings, and he taught it himself. And we're going to see elements of this in the Clouds. Unfortunately, it's not very well done. It's sort of a parody of these initiation rites and secret cult-like facilities, these little thinkeries, these little huts that they would get together in, keep the world out, and they would go through these initiation rites and learn all these secrets of nature, and study geometry and astronomy and other things that were useless, precisely because they were useless. There are 6 basic principles in Empedocles' system. There are the 4 elements. There's earth, air, fire, and water. And then there are 2 principles that cause the elements to move around and get reorganized. And those principles are love and strife. Okay, there are 4 elements, earth, air, fire, and water. And these are the material stuff out of which everything is made. But then the question is, well, how do they get rearranged and what causes the processes of transformation? He said there are 2 forces that do that. There's love and strife. Love is the force that brings everything together, and strife is the force that disperses everything. The force of integration and disintegration are what the forces of love and strife are. Let me just read a couple of these little fragments, which I think are really very interesting. First of all, number 28 on page 61. Friends who dwell in the great city wall on the yellow, on the heights of the citadel, you whose care is good deeds, respectful havens for strangers, untouched by evil, hail, I go about among you an immortal God, no longer mortal. Honored among all as it seems, wreathed with headbands and blooming garlands. Wherever I go to their flourishing cities, I am revered by the men and women, and they follow together in tens of thousands, inquiring where lies the path to profit. Some in need of prophecy, while others, pierced for a long time with harsh pains, asked to hear the voices of healing for all diseases. And so here he is, this itinerant teacher. And tens of thousands of people are flocking to this living God to find, the way out of their suffering. And he's sort of a bodhisattva, I guess, is what he thinks of himself. He's attained enlightenment, but instead of just dying, he's stuck around to teach all of us the way to salvation. And this is what he conceived of himself as doing. On page 67, but I shall return to that path of songs which I recounted before, drawing off from one account this account. When strife had reached the lowest depth of the vortex and love comes to be in the middle of the whirl, at this point all these things come together to be one single thing, not at once, but willingly banding together, different ones from different places. As they were mixed, myriads of tribes of mortal things poured forth, but many contrary wise remained unmixed while they were mingling, all that strife still held back aloft. For had it not entirely completed its brainless retreat from them to the furthest limits of the circle, that it remained in some of the limbs, while from others it had withdrawn. Now this is very hard to figure out. Okay? But again, the idea is apparently there's some kind of great cosmic whirlpool or vortex out of which all things are emerging. And the principle of love is apparently the principle that causes things to congeal together and form into something solid, whereas strife causes them to dissolve and disperse. I don't know any more to say than that. But again, this is an interesting and peculiar teaching, and you're going to find echoes of it in the clouds. On page 68 and 69, too, there are some passages about the origin of living things. Number 52, at the bottom of 68. By her love, many necklace faces sprouted. That arms were wandering naked, bereft of shoulders, and eyes were roaming alone in need of foreheads. In this situation, the members were still single-limbed as a result of the separation caused by strife, and they wandered about, aiming at mixture with one another. So, first of all, you have these disjecta membra, these bits of bodies floating around. And then what happens is that love draws the bodies together into full moving organisms. But when divinity was mixed to a greater extent with divinity, when these things began to fall together, however they chanced to meet, and many others besides them arose continuously. So there's a kind of random process where all these things come, together, and out of this process form living entities, animals. Many came into being with faces and chests on both sides, man-faced ox progeny, and some to the contrary rose up as ox-headed things with the form of men, compounded partly from men and partly from women, fitted with shadowy parts. Now, all of these creatures, of course, failed to survive, but after a long enough period of time of random collocations of body parts, things were put together that actually worked. And so you have the basis of a kind of evolution and natural selection through random mutation account of the origin of living things. Again, there's no necessity of referring to gods at all. And now let's flip to Diogenes of Apollonia. We just have a couple things to look at from him. Diogenes of Apollonia is mentioned, or his teachings are mentioned in Plato's Phaedo. Okay, we'll see that later. He was an approximate contemporary of Socrates, a bit older, and he hung around Athens, and so his teachings were widely known. Let's look on page 94, number 5. And in my opinion, that which possesses intelligence is what people call air, and all humans are governed by it, and it rules all things. For in my opinion, this very thing is God, and it reaches everything and arranges all things and is everything, or is in everything. And there is no single thing which does not share in this, but no single thing shares in it the same way as anything else, for there are many forms both of air itself and of intelligence. For it is multiform, hotter and colder, drier and wetter, more stable and possessing a sharper movement, and unlimitedly many other alterations are in it, both of flavor and of color. So this is probably why Anaximenes chose air too, because it's just something you can imagine taking on infinite different forms, especially if, again, you look at clouds and see them taking on shapes and how fluid they are. On page 95, number 8, air is the element. There are unlimited worlds and unlimited void. The air, by being condensed and rarefied, is generative of the worlds. Nothing comes to be from or perishes into what is not. The earth is round and is supported in the center of the cosmos and has undergone its process of formation through the rotation, again a vortex, resulting from the hot and the solidification caused by the cold. Strange stuff. All things are in motion and there are infinite worlds. His account of cosmogony is the following. The whole is in motion and comes to be rare in one place, dense in another. Where the dense part chanced to come together, it formed the earth by revolving, and the other things in the same way. The lightest things occupied the highest position and produced the sun. Go figure. Take it or leave it, too. The fragments, they're bereft of the arguments for why we should believe these things for the most part. The main characteristic of these natural philosophers was the attempt to, first of all, come up with a non-theistic, non-mythological explanation for everything. You don't need gods to explain the cosmos. You can explain it in terms of natural forces, natural necessity, not design, not will, not choice. Another characteristic is that they do make reference to gods or divine principles, but their gods are entirely improvident. They have no concern with human affairs. They're just purely theoretical gods. They might get the cosmos moving, they might, get the vortex spinning. That's it. They don't have minds, so how could they be concerned about us? Well, Xenophanes' God is mind, but water doesn't have mind, or air doesn't have mind. So either they're mindless principles, or if their minds are unconcerned with merely human affairs. In any case, they're improvident gods. And the third common feature is that they're entirely unconcerned with moral or practical issues. The whole point of early Greek natural philosophy is, in a sense, to rise above the merely practical and to understand what nature is. And there's an implicit assumption here that nature is not moral. If you look out into the natural world, you discover just these natural forces moving around by necessity. You do not discover any right or wrong, any moral law written into nature. Just the forces of necessity. So what does one do with the gods and morality? If it's excluded from the realm of nature, it's placed in a different realm. It's placed in the realm of convention or custom. And what happens at this time is the concepts of, in Greek, nomos or dike, which can be translated as law and justice or right, lose their primitive meaning, as the way of things. And nomos and dike become lines of convention, or treated as convention, things that exist by agreement of human beings. They're cultural things. Law and right are matters of culture. Any notion of law or right in the moral sense is removed from the natural realm, and the term for nature is physis, right? Which is the word physics. So there's a distinction that's made in these Greek philosophers between things that happen by nature and things that happen by convention. And the things that happen by nature are amoral. And the things that happen by convention include the realms of the gods, the mythological gods, right, and morality. And that's it. Now that is interesting, and the implications become striking when one adds another, fourth characteristic of these early Greek philosophers of nature, which is that they regarded nature as, if anything's good, it's going to be nature. If anything's worthy of true respect, it's nature. Conventions are not worthy of any respect. They're contemptible. And the main reason for this is that nature is unchanging. Now, what does that mean? Well, everything's changing around us, right? And the weather, the seasons, but the patterns of nature never change. The underlying causes of natural phenomena are eternal, unchanging principles. Whereas with human conventions and customs, there's a recognition that they change. And they change over time and from place to place. They're relative to time and place. And, well, let me ask you, what do you want to bank on? Things that never change or things that are always changing, always in flux? For the ancient Greek natural philosophers, what's unchanging is what's best, and what changes is contemptible. And therefore the realm of convention, the realm of human things, if you will, was regarded by these people with a certain amount of contempt. And human beings who are too caught up in human things were regarded with a great deal of contempt. This was true among the natural philosophers, the Pythagoreans, people like Empedocles. Ordinary human beings were regarded as contemptible because they're caught up in the things that change, that are unimportant, that just flow along. And morality was regarded as somewhat contemptible. Because again, it's merely a matter of convention. Now, these purely theoretical thinkers laid the foundations for a school of thought that was almost entirely practical in its orientation, and that was the Sophists. The Sophists accepted the basic metaphysical framework that we have up here, especially the distinction between nature and convention, and the value judgments that were made about that distinction. They regarded nature as good and convention as contemptible. Now, when you want to turn your attention to human affairs with that distinction in mind, and you want to ask yourself, how do we govern ourselves? Then the answer is this: we govern ourselves by nature, not by convention. And what is nature in human beings? How does nature manifest itself in a human being? What's the most natural thing about us? I mean, as opposed to the merely conventional or customary. What's the most natural? Your urges, your desires. What's that?
Or the mind.
Yeah, well, but even, put it this way, the mind is so heavily stamped with convention, right, that the body would be more natural than the mind in some sense. And the most natural thing about the body are our desires. You find that those things are invariant from human being to human being, right? We all need to eat, we all need to sleep, so on and so forth. We all have our little lusts. So that's just, that's what's human, that's what's natural. And so what the Sophists taught is that we need to live by nature, not by convention. And to live by nature meant, for the Sophists, to satisfy your desires as best you possibly can. And so we'll break off here, but let me just say that at the beginning of the next session, when we look at the clouds, we'll look at these little tiny chunks from Protagoras' thought. There are just 4 of them, 4 little sentences. And we'll look at this passage from Antiphon, which is number 16 on page 105. And in the Antiphon thing particularly, the distinction between nature and convention is very clearly operative and is very clear as the foundation for Sophists. The Sophists taught living by nature. And that meant a certain amount of cavalier contempt for law and for morality, because these were merely conventional. Now, there was another group that also had this very same teaching. And this is the group known as the Cynics. Now, the Cynics were really not a defined school of philosophy until after the time of Socrates. But the Cynics also believed that you should live by nature, meaning to satisfy your basic desires, not by convention. And the main distinction between the Cynics and the Sophists were this. The Sophists were somewhat conventional about their desires still. So when they looked into their desires, they decided, well, I desire to get rich, and I desire to get famous, and I desire to have power. And these are fairly conventional desires. I want a big house, I want a Lexus, and on and on and on. And so what they did is they went to law school, basically, right? They went to study how to become politically powerful by arguing in the public. And what they wanted is they wanted to get rich, they wanted to get powerful, they wanted to get famous. The Cynics saw through that, and they thought, look, these people are just as enslaved to convention as anybody else. They think they've seen through it all, but they're just caught up in material gain, merely conventional needs. No one needs a big house. No one needs a lot of clothes. No one needs these things, these luxuries. To live by nature means to live by the barest of necessities. The highest good for a human being is to be free. And to be free, for the Cynics, meant that you just gave nature its barest due. So Diogenes the Cynic was famous for living in a rain barrel, because he didn't need a house. And he went around barefoot and had on a single ragged cloak. And a lot of these people looked to Socrates as a model, because Socrates lived a life of voluntary simplicity as well, and valued his freedom more than anything else, too. The Cynics regarded the gods as contemptible, and Diogenes was known to clout people who were worshipping the gods over the head with his staff. And that was the only use he had for it. He would chase people away from religious shrines. He was quite dirty because you didn't need to wash every day. That was just a luxury. He had a cup or a bowl, for his food, but he threw his cup away when he saw a beggar drinking water with his cupped hands, because he realized this man had taught him a lesson that we didn't need cups. Nature had provided cups for us. And when he saw a little boy dipping lentils out of a pot with a piece of bread, he threw his bowl away too, because he realized that wasn't necessary as well. And so he pared his life down to the absolute bare minimum. And he lived like homeless people live today. But instead of being deinstitutionalized schizophrenic, somebody who drinks a lot, he was living this way on high moral principle, because he thought that this was the best kind of life for a human being. He was dirty, ragged, and filthy. But he felt that he was free, and that he was good, because he was living by nature, and he had nothing but the most lofty of contempt for ordinary people, including the sophists, who were so caught up with worldly things and conventional desires. Now, I mentioned the Cynics because there's a strand of cynicism you're going to see in the clouds too. Cynicism before there was cynicism. And the reason for that is that a lot of the sophists looked to Socrates. And they look to this portrait of Socrates, which has some merit as a guide. But Socrates is also shown in the clouds as a sophist. And what the sophists did, again, to get ahead and be rich, is they taught the art of public speaking, basically, because that was the key to wealth and power in ancient Greece. They taught how to make the weaker argument the stronger. And the reason why they felt this was okay is, again, if you learned how to swindle people, gain political power and so forth over them, that would be a way of satisfying your desires. Morality and religion and all these conventional scruples were contemptible, and you needed to free yourself from these things as much as possible. However, you also needed to know how to exploit these things as much as possible in order to gain power over other people. We'll see all this when we look in the clouds.
The Cynics sought to free themselves from desires. Is that the idea?
They sought to free themselves from any unnecessary desires, any unnatural desires. Exactly. And when you think about what are the basic necessary desires for human beings, there are very few. Food, clothing, shelter, occasional sexual intercourse. Nothing else. They didn't have families. Diogenes was sometimes seen masturbating in the marketplace. And no, he didn't have to go into a darkened theater to do it. Diogenes was seen masturbating in the marketplace once because he had divested himself of things like shame that got in the way of the satisfaction of his natural desires. And somebody rebuked him for this shameful activity, and he said, Would that I could only satisfy the hungers of my belly simply by rubbing it. And he went on about his business. These are strange people. We'll see all of these things in the clouds because Socrates in the clouds is shown to be a kind of combination of all the pre-Socratic schools. And what Aristophanes is also trying to show us is the inner harmony of all these pre-Socratic schools, even though they look radically different. From these zonked-out Pythagoreans, eating vegetables and starving themselves in their little ashrams, to these natural philosophers who were gazing at the stars and falling down wells, to these well-dressed, bejeweled sophists, with their if it doesn't fit, you must acquit kind of oratory. And these cynics sitting around in their rags masturbating in the marketplace. All of these guys look radically different. Yet at the same time, there's an inner coherence in all these schools of thought. And one of the things that Aristophanes is going to do is he's going to show the inner coherence by showing how they can all be characteristics of a single man. And unfortunately, the poor butt of this is Socrates.